everybody who has ever flown this plane calls their heroics the war they never told you about. Because even while being the most produced American fighter of the war, despite crippling the Luftwaffe, going toe-to-toe with the Japanese, and breaking the back of the German Wehrmacht in less than a year, its achievements were almost always overshadowed by those of its rival, the P-51 Mustang. That changes today. Today we're going to talk about America's first flying tank, the OG thrust brick and the A-10's grandpa, the P-47 Thunderbolt. This thing has a lot of nicknames. There's the Bolt, the T-Bolt, the Fatty from Farmingdale, and most commonly, the Jug. Now, that last one was because it looked like a flying milk jug, but the British tried to give us some extra credit and thought it was short for Juggernaut because of how heavy it was. But we don't need it, because Grandpa Hog here is probably America's first true rendition of its long-standing habit of making flying bricks that make you drop bricks. At least assuming there's enough left of you to do so.
For a brick, he flew pretty good.
Previously, I called the F-15 my favorite fighter jet of all time. This plane is the reason I specified jet, because there is something uniquely American about hitting the enemy with a flying milk jug strapped up with a freedom ton of guns and ordnance that only flies because you gave it enough thrust to disregard the air. But despite the accolades it has well earned, it frequently takes a reputational backseat to its long-range rival. And we're gonna fix that today, right after a word from me. You guys have probably been seeing a lot of this already, so I'll try and keep it quick, but YouTube's been getting a lot of attention lately for their restricted mode. This isn't new, it's been around since frickin' 2010, but it's basically YouTube's child lock for mature content, their official definition of which is may include explicit language, violence, or suggestive themes. Which is like my entire video, every week. I curse as much as YouTube will let me, I crack jokes about plowing holes like a Marine, and most importantly, I talk about war. War ain't pretty, period, and I'm not here to treat you like a baby whenever I drop a history lesson.
All buffalo and babies will be beaten senseless by every able-bodied patron in the bar.
Now, YouTube isn't supposed to touch that setting. It is your call, or your workplace's call if they force it for your network. But at some point last month, they changed it so now you have Skynet as your personal content filter. And apparently the Terminators are going around pushing buttons, because a couple of people have told me that they found their restricted modes turned on without their permission. The machines are taking over, and for some reason their first order of business is to smoke videos like mine. So make sure that setting's turned off in your profile on desktop or in your settings on the mobile app if you want to keep seeing the funny airplane man that sometimes does everything else. And now that that's said and done, it's time to dance. While America hadn't actually entered World War II by 1939, the country and its military leadership were well aware that war was likely, and preparations had already begun. Such preparations included getting people like Willis Ching Lee to get radars and proximity fuse rounds into service across the Navy, but on the Army Air Corps side of things, they expected that the war in the air would be primarily fought with bombers. And so in September of 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps would issue a requirement for a lightweight interceptor fighter. Curtiss responded with a lightened P-40 Warhawk known as the XP-47, while Republic and their lead designer Alexander Cardvelli sent in the XP-47, which was based on the P-43 Lancer. The P-43 is pretty much forgotten to history because it was only ever conceived as a backup plan. For the military, it was a backup in case the P-40 failed, and a lifeline for the wildly mismanaged Republic company. For Republic, or at the time Seversky, the P-43 was a desperate upgrade over its predecessor, the P-35, to try and snag said dying company some more orders, either on the domestic or export markets. Because in the nicest possible terms, the P-35 was a steaming pile of bovine fecal matter, but the original XP-47 looked like an estranged cousin to both of these, because both submissions had to be designed around the early Allison 1710 V12 liquid-cooled inline engines. These were the same engines in the early P-40s that produced just over 1,000 horsepower, because the Army was obsessed with the concept that the lower-profile inline engines generated less drag and thus better performance, which really worked against Republic because their models preferred using radial air-cooled engines instead.
But you can't do this to me.
The only real difference between the two of them was that the XP-47 had the classic Republic edition of bolting a two-stage turbocharger onto anything made to fly. This two-stage turbocharger relied on compressing excess intake air before injecting it into the engine cylinders for better performance at high altitudes. The air coming from the intake would go through that compressor first, then to the cooler to bring the air temperature back down, because when you crank up the pressure, the air also heats up. You disturbed its slumber, and now it has to quantify its spike towards you somehow.
thousands of years I lay dormant. Who has disturbed my...
Hey, best buddy.
Oh, it's you.
Then, after being literally told to chill out, it's thrown into the engine, lit back on fire, then thrown out the back through a turbine that drives the original compressor before getting thrown back out into the atmosphere. Breathe it in, make it hate reality, cool it down, make it hate everything again, but worse, put it to work and then throw it away. It's like using your pension to pay off a parking ticket with extra steps.
Oh, government paying the government.
But all in all, the original XP-47 was basically a flying garbage heap that wasn't going to do what it needed to do because it just didn't have enough power to do it. And so in the meantime, Republican Cartvelli started looking into a way to upgrade the P-43 with their classic comfort radial engines in a project called the XP-44. First, they tried out the original Pratt & Whitney R2180 Twin Wasp, there were two, which was pathetically underpowered and got thrown out pretty quick. Then they tried the 1600 horsepower Wright R2600 Twin Cyclone, but that one wasn't compatible with the turbocharger, so that went out the window too. Then they came across Pratt & Whitney's latest work, the 2000 horsepower R2800 Double Wasp. This engine had just entered mass production that year, and it only existed because the Army had walked into Pratt & Whitney a while ago and said, hey, you should make an inline engine instead of these weak radials, they're way better and can produce way more horsepower. To which Pratt & Whitney responded,
No. Don't like that.
And then they proceeded to make one of the most iconic radial engines of the entire Second World War, powering multiple different noteworthy aircraft, 3 of which are absolutely legendary. Pro tip, never underestimate how far spite can take somebody in the world. And Republic wasn't about those inline engines either, so game recognized game, and they would sign a contract for 80 Double Wasps, becoming one of the first American customers for the new Pratt & Whitney engine. With the new engine in hand, the XP-44 was starting to look more impressive despite the higher fuel consumption, but then the Army Air Corps got hit with a dose of reality. By mid-1940, British combat experience made it really obvious how easily bomber formations could be torn apart without proper fighter escorts, and that experience made its way back to the United States. This finally started to kick the Army Air Corps' understanding door of air warfare wide open, and so they would close their interceptor program and call Cartvelli to come look at a new set of requirements. That June, the Army would lay out the desire for a high-altitude fighter escort that could reach past 400 miles an hour at 25,000 feet with armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks with 315 gallons in them, and 6 wing-mounted 50-caliber machine guns, 8 if they could get away with it. There was some consideration of the 20mm British Hispano cannons, but they had a really short attack range because the British had reduced the powder charge in each of their rounds so the recoil wouldn't tear the wings off the planes they used. This reduced the max range of the 20mm to less than that of the 50 cals, and while they were destructive on hit, you gotta remember that America doesn't subscribe to bigger is better, we believe in accuracy by volume. Take a number and wait for your turn to die, we'll get to you shortly.
You do that again, and I will bury you alive.
Cartvelli immediately recognized that any plane able to do all of those things would have to be massive, and neither the XP-44 or the existing XP-47 was going to cut it. So on the train ride home, he took the P-43 and stuck it on the torture rack. He stretched out the wings to support more load and the fuselage to boost maneuverability, remade the controls, built the entire thing around the R2800 and the turbocharger Republic Special to create the XP-47B. And when I say they built the airplane around the engine, I mean it. If the A-10 is a gun with wings, then the P-47 was going to be an engine block with wings. This thing was a flying Dodge Challenger Hellcat with 850 cals and bomb racks, driven by madmen and absolutely terrifying to think of being in the general vicinity of.
Now, which one's the club? Okay, we're driving!
They had to make the landing gear telescopic just to give the jug enough propeller clearance. It was so big you could have fit an entire P-51 inside of a P-47, almost literally. And despite the massive engine, thanks to how its engine cowl was designed, the aircraft's drag coefficient, or a single parameter used to represent how much drag an aircraft generates regardless of speed or altitude, was second only to that of the P-51 Mustang and the P-63 King Cobra. And aside from the King Cobra looking car door to the cockpit, the XP-47B was nearly identical to the P-47 that we now know and love. The prototype rolled off the factory floor on the 4th of May 1941, and it was set up for its first flight 2 days later. And that first flight was almost a disaster. After a 2,500-foot takeoff roll from a wet dirt field, oil that had accumulated in the supercharger ducting after the engine run-up tests began heating up and started filling the cockpit with smoke. The test pilot then decided that if his eyes can't support him, the ground better do it instead. So rather than landing back on the dirt field, he flew over to the paved runway at Mitchell Field and put her down safe. Problem, nobody was supposed to see this yet. So everybody over at the airfield sees this brand new, never-before-seen brick shithouse of an aircraft butter a landing, and naturally they come out running to see it. Because, well, when was the last time you got to see the defiance of physics incarnate? And the senior officers Ours also saw this, and they went straight to Code Brown and cleared the area to put that thing away. But the test proved that while the plane was overweight by 900 pounds and 17 gallons of gas short, the handling and power were excellent. The speed at altitude was as expected, and the engine was just as reliable as Pratt & Whitney had advertised. They did eventually have to replace the fabric tails with all metal ones after a high-speed dive test turned crash revealed that the fabric would literally tear itself off the plane at 400 miles an hour, but that fix and others were put into effect on the P-47B that rolled out in November of 1941. But the Thunderbolt still wasn't perfect and had some remaining issues to tease out, so to make sure the design was fully fixed up and ready to fight, Republic had planned to hold on to it and fine-tune it for about another year. That testing would go well enough the P-47 would actually finish 3 months ahead of schedule, and so the first batch of 37 Thunderbolts would enter service with the now U.S. Army Air Forces in June of 1942, and more specifically, the 56th Fighter Group led by Colonel Hub Zemke, and it would establish its reputation for durability right off the bat. While the pilots were still adapting to the new plane and sorting through its quirks, trainees would walk away from the Thunderbolt crashes a lot more often than most, both because it was big and because the ducting for its turbocharger ran underneath the cockpit and acted as a crumple zone like the one you have in a car on crash landings.
Just a little peck, a smooch like you're kissing your sister.
This aircraft feels like one of the best cases of where the designers actually thought of everything, because even with that crumple zone, the Bolt actually had crash skids built into the airframe structure right beneath the cockpit. It was pilot-friendly quirks like these that made the Jug's reputation skyrocket, and these things started literally flying off the shelves faster than Republic could build them. Thankfully, in November 1942, the War Production Board cleared the company to build a second factory, and production had finally started catching up by the plane's first deployment in January 1943. However, the 56th Fighter Group wouldn't receive their B-model Thunderbolts they'd gotten so used to training with when they arrived in Britain. Those were kept back for training new units, and the squadron got off the boat to find brand new P-47Cs. These new models had the same aluminum and steel airframe with 3/8-inch armor plating and ballistic glass protecting the pilot, and the same 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns with 3,340 rounds, but there was a slight difference.
Same, but different.
One of the biggest issues with the P-47B was that it took an eternity to replace the engine. Republic would then listen to that field feedback and extend the C's fuselage by 8 inches in front of the firewall, which made it a lot easier for maintainers to swap the engine out and cut replacement times by over 60%. The length extension surgery also proved that 8 inches makes a massive difference in more than just fun, because the C model got a performance upgrade along with it. Thanks to the extension moving the center of gravity forward, the increased distance from the tail controls actually made the plane a little more maneuverable. This quick engine change modification would be retrofitted to every B model as well, so I guess they were kind of the same in the end.
But still same.
P-47s and the 56th would finally see combat in April of 1943, drawing its first blood on April 15th. Zemke's Wolf Pack, as they would come to be known, would go on to score 500 kills before the man left command of the unit, and it would only keep kicking more from there as they figured out the tactics for it. And those tactics could be summed up in 3 words: boom and zoom. The P-47 had been designed to do its best work at 25,000 feet, and since a lot of aircraft couldn't really keep pace with it, if they went up there, they'd get demolished. So it was a better idea for German formations to fly lower. But if they were down there, the P-47s could then dive on them, fire on them, then pull up and get their altitude back, rinse and repeat until the skies are sparkling clean. At least if everything went according to plan. If it didn't, the P-47 was stupidly heavy. Like, this thing had a max takeoff weight of about 17,500 pounds, or nearly 8 metric tons, which meant that while its combat performance was way more limited at lower altitudes and it couldn't climb away from anybody if things got foobarred, it could certainly dive away from most of its enemies. Holy hell, could that thing dive. The Jug could aim to faceplant the planet at 550 miles an hour and eat altitude for breakfast in the process. There was a pilot who was quoted as saying, "I have never seen a plane that could get rid of such appalling hunks of altitude in so short a time." But this diving power would also become an example of how too much of a good thing can turn into an Uno reverse card, because this plane could dive so well that the air over the wings would start to bust through the speed of sound.
Going faster! Too fast! Too fast!
This was a phenomenon known as compressibility. Basically, the shockwaves resulting from the airflow going over the wings at the speed of Mach Jesus would tank the air pressure behind them, which then turns your controls into paperweights. On the P-47, pilots would typically walk away from compressed dives they had recovered from with bruised thighs because the ailerons would flutter and shake the control stick all over the inside of the cockpit. This phenomenon also resulted in Republic falsely believing that they had broken the sound barrier. Turns out the pressure sensor that measured the P-47's speed was placed right where the shockwaves took place, thus causing the pilot to think he broke 725 miles an hour, which at that altitude was Mach 1.2. They didn't actually break that, and don't ask me why the P-47 has a speedometer that breaks Mach 1. I couldn't tell you. I mean, it certainly wouldn't have been very good for its fuel range, which already wasn't great, especially if they had to fly at lower altitudes. After D-Day, the US had a forward airbase established next to Omaha Beach for missions, which definitely helped, but until that was done on June 16, 1944, it was not uncommon for Luftwaffe pilots to wait for Thunderbolts to turn around from their escort missions before shooting their shots with the bombers. But a lot of these issues would be handled with the multitude of upgrades that came to the most proliferated model of the Jug, the P-47D. Entering service within a few months of the C model, the early D versions were not all that different. The earliest changes were things like additional cowling flaps to help prevent the engine from overheating as much, but the Thunderbolt would start turning into a hot rod from the D4 model onwards when they gave it a 30-gallon tank of nitrous. This wasn't actually nitrous, it was a mixture of water and methyl alcohol, or methanol, but when that was injected into the double Wasp's 18 cylinders, it would kick the horsepower from somewhere around 2,000 to somewhere close to 2,800. Then Republic would turn to look at the range problem because it still really couldn't protect the bombers all that well. There appears to be some degree of conspiracy that the bomber mafia, or the cadre of individuals who preferred the philosophy of using standalone bombers to win wars, deliberately withheld the P-47's potential by not giving it the external tanks it needed to escort bombers all the way, and presented as evidence the fact that it could carry a 200-gallon tank that looks like somebody flattened a molar and filled it with gasoline. And while I can't say I like the bomber mafia's philosophy either, that story appears to be a load of fanboy horseshit because the real problem was twofold. One, the P-47 didn't have a whole lot of internal gas to begin with, and the only hard point piped for external tanks at first was the centerline one. And two, the P-47 flew so high up that any drop tanks had to be pressurized. The 200-gallon tooth tank wasn't, so it wouldn't pump gas above 18,000 feet, and thus would have been completely useless for escort missions anyways. So the Jug was stuck between a rock and a hard place until something changed, and the tank problem got fixed first. In August and then in September of 1943, the Army Air Force introduced 75-gallon and then 108-gallon pressurized tanks respectively, and the former added about 110 miles or 180 kilometers to the range per tank, while each of the latter added about 150 miles or 240 kilometers. Once the first pressurized tanks came out in August, then the Thunderbolt was allowed to start performing escort missions. But as demonstrated by the Luftwaffe's tactics, it still wasn't enough, at least not until the D-15 model came out in December of 1943. This version of the Jug came out to play with 370 gallons of internal gas and finally wet wing hardpoints.
Wet.
That meant it could actually carry wing tanks, and now within only 5 months of actually starting its escort mission set, P-47s went from the Luftwaffe waiting for them to turn around to being able to reach out and touch the German cities of both Frankfurt and Hamburg. And that didn't exactly give the Luftwaffe a whole lot of places to hide. Said hiding places would decrease even further that same month when the D-22 models came out and got bigger propellers with wider blades, aptly nicknamed the paddle propellers for the spanking they were about to lay upside some German ass every time they wanted to climb away. Because guess what? They couldn't do that anymore. The paddle propellers improved the climb rates of the Jug so drastically that by itself it completely negated the climb advantage of the Bf-109s. Robert Johnson, the second highest scoring ace of the European theater, claimed in his autobiography that the paddle prop by itself was worth an extra 1,000 horsepower, and that he had used it to even outclimb a Mark 9 Spitfire. You know, just in case you needed more proof that this plane is a hot rod posing as a warbird. The D-25 Thunderbolts would then inherit the bubble canopy from the Hawker Tempest, and the D-40s would get the gyroscopic K-14 lead computing gun sight and the 10 5-inch rocket stations. But the Thunderbolt still wasn't in its final form. Turns out the P-47 was still in such high demand that Republic still couldn't produce them fast enough. So the Army Air Forces turned around and ordered the Curtiss Aircraft Company, the same business that Republic competed against to start this whole adventure, to start building P-47Ds under license as the P-47G. The P-47 story didn't just come full circle on Curtiss, it shoved the table of contents down its fucking throat. And they weren't even done writing the book yet, because Republic kept trying to add even more speed to this flying tank they called an airplane. We're past hot rod levels at this point. Now they're making a damn NASCAR racer. 433 mile an hour top speed, not fast enough. I want to start flirting with the sound barrier and level flight if I can. So they tried throwing in an uprated engine and a new turbocharger to make the P-47M. The prototypes also had dive brakes, but those didn't really stick around. However, the M model would take a little while to teeth out all of its issues, and the 130 they actually built wouldn't see any real combat until the last few months of the war. But on the other side of the world in the Pacific theater, the Thunderbolt was getting just about as much glory. The Jug had been built to rain hell down from on high, and compared to that, most Pacific ops were down in the mud and the weeds. This did not work well when they had to go have bedtime fun with holes in the planet.
I need to hear it.
Him in the vagina!
All right, but I'm gonna have to make one.
The lower altitude meant they could use those giant unpressurized mouth grinder tanks to extend their range. But on the rare occasions when they were ordered to go punch that guy in the face, they learned pretty quick to stick to boom and zoom tactics, aka altitude camping the much slower Japanese planes. Between August and December of 1943, P-47s of the 348th Fighter Group claimed over 150 victories to the loss of only 8 pilots, and their commanding officer, Colonel Neil Kirby, would become both the highest scoring Pacific P-47 ace with 22 kills and one of those 8 losses on March 6, 1944, when he broke his own rule and got ambushed at lower altitude. The P-47 would be withdrawn from the Southwest Pacific in mid-1944, right as another squadron brought other P-47s to the Central Pacific for the Battle of Saipan for ground attack. Only after Iwo Jima was captured in March of 1945 would P-47s once again be able to return to air-to-air combat. This combat would happen as part of the long-range bomber escort rules, and those missions would include the latest version of the 47 the following month, the P-47N. Nicknamed the Sprinter variant, this Jug version was arguably the ultimate P-47, and tailor-made to escort B-29s all the way to Japan and back.
It was perfect.
These 47s had longer wings to carry internal fuel tanks, which pushed the aircraft's internal gas capacity up to 556 gallons and gave it a 2,000-mile range with drop tanks equipped. These models, however, had taken a lot longer to arrive, being ordered in June of 44, first delivered in September of 44, but only arriving in April of 45. Nonetheless, 1,816 of these P-47Ns would join the Thunderbolt ranks and participate in the escort missions, as well as anti-kamikaze sweeps over southern Japan. And the P-47 was actually really good at these because the only real strength of kamikazes was that there was a lot of them. And luckily for the P-47s, they had a lot of bullets. With 3,340 rounds of 50 cal, this thing was basically the magic eraser for kamikazes. One sweep of the skies and everything's gone, squeaky clean.
Without a trace.
The 318th Fighter Squadron would shoot down nearly 40 aircraft in just 2 missions in late May 1945 of these kamikaze sweeps. But for the most part, the P-47s would put warheads on foreheads during the rest of its time in the war. By that point, there were still almost 6,000 orders awaiting production. But after the Japanese surrender in August 15, 1945, all of them were cancelled and the last P-47 left the production line in October of 1945. The P-47 would become the most produced single-engine fighter made by the US in World War II, with more than 15,680 planes built between 1941 and 1945, and the rate of production on that was absolutely insane. By the end of 1945, there were 532 in combat service. By the end of 1943, that number had grown to 4,428. And by the end of 1944, there were more than 7,000 P-47s kicking and taking names on both sides of the world. And the P-47 wouldn't see service with just the US either. 830 went to the UK, 203 went to the Soviet Union, and the Free French flew 446 of them. Brazilian pilots would fly 88 Thunderbolts over Italy and the Pacific. Mexican pilots flew 25 more in the Philippines, and at least 3 more were captured and flown by the Germans. There were also numerous experimental models that came and went both throughout the war and into the early jet era. But this is all just what the airplane was. We haven't even gotten to all the fun parts yet. And the fun part is ogling at the voluptuous quantity of nice things the P-47 took away. Thunderbolts would fly close air support, bomber escort, and even search and rescue missions, and in the process took out roughly 7,000 enemy aircraft, more than half of which in air-to-air combat. On the flip side, 5,222 P-47s were destroyed, 1,723 to accidents, and only about 800 to air-to-air combat. The vast majority of its losses were to ground fire, but that still only brought the loss rate down to 0.7 P-47s per mission and the air-to-air kill ratio to 4.6 to 1 over the course of more than 500,000 missions. Following the role shift to ground strike before and especially after D-Day thanks to Allied air superiority, the P-47 would drop over 132,000 tons of ordnance. From D-Day until the end of the war in Europe, so just the European theater, P-47s destroyed over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks.
That's a lot of damage!
Now, it is possible that these numbers might be somewhat inflated due to the still maturing battle damage assessment or BDA techniques at the time. But even if they are a little off, I need you to remember something here. That was from D-Day to VE or Victory in Europe Day. D-Day was June 6, 1944. VE Day was May 7, 1945. Those two dates are 11 months apart almost to the day, which means that these stats aren't the P-47's combat record of the whole war. It's probably a solid chunk of it, but it's not all of it. This is just what the P-47 did to Europe in less than a year, and it picked up some of the wildest stories in that time frame as well, because at least one of them is history repeating itself. People think that the A-10 memes that came out of Russia when they invaded Ukraine with their 40-mile long armor and supply lines was just a funny haha this would be perfect kind of deal, but nobody realizes the A-10 was secretly getting the urge to follow through from Grandpa's DNA the entire time.
That was literally neuron activation.
On December 17, 1944, the day after the Germans launched the counterattack that became the Battle of the Bulge, a flight of 4 P-47s led by Major John Motzenbecker found a column of over 150 Wehrmacht tanks, trucks, and half-tracks clogging the road out of Monschau, Germany that stretched for 4.5 miles. While he was looking around, he took a piece of flak shrapnel through the wing, which to a P-47 is like hitting a fly on the wall, nothing at all, and zooms back to altitude. He calls in the rest of his squadron, the 387th Fighter Squadron, packing 16 P-47s, and tells them to come help him, and after confirming with the area controller that he was in fact looking at the enemy, he said, and I quote, "Send in reinforcements, we're going down on them." And that is exactly what they did, because these jugs absolutely f***ed the German column. According to Mutzenbecker's account, the squadron took out 115 vehicles and artillery pieces and crippled 65 more to the loss of only 2 Thunderbolts. These things were a monster to German surface forces, and they racked up all kinds of crazy feats in the process. For example, the T-Bolts might not have been able to pen the armor plating with their 50 cals, but German Tiger tanks were so fuel hungry that they would sometimes pull their own fuel trailers behind them, and the P-47s would shoot those out and let the Tigers run dry. Then there was a search and rescue P-47 credited with shooting down a V-1 buzz bomb. But probably the cherry on top crowning achievement came when 2 P-47s flown by the Tuskegee Airmen either sank or just obliterated a whole warship using just their 50 cals. On June 25, 1944, Lieutenant Gwen Pearson and Lieutenant Wendell Pruitt made a strafing run over the Adriatic Sea near the Trieste harbor in Italy against what they thought was a German destroyer, and claimed to have sunk it when they struck the ship's powder magazine. What they didn't know was that ship was the TA-22, an Italian World War I era destroyer turned torpedo ship that the Germans had commandeered. Kriegsmarine records confirmed that the ship was heavily damaged that day, but deny that it was sunk. And while it didn't fight the Allies again, it was decommissioned in November and scuttled the following year. Some people have used this as a justification to claim they didn't actually sink the ship, but what I'm willing to bet happened was they went in on that strafing run, did enough damage to hit one of the torpedoes below decks, and thus generate the kind of continental detonation that makes you say, yeah, I'm pretty sure that thing's f***ing dead, because they probably sent a few bolts to the moon. So can we confirm that they actually physically sank the ship? Maybe not. Am I gonna give them the credit anyways? Absolutely. They did enough damage that it was never seen again and decommissioned within months. Now, in all fairness, if this was an airplane that got crippled and made its way back to base with the pilot on board, I probably wouldn't count it. But that was a ship. That is a way bigger fish to fry, especially considering they used nothing but their machine gun fire to send half the ship to God, and the very likely possibility that an explosion of that scale meant the ship needed help to get home.
That still only counts as one.
And speaking of planes coming home damaged, the P-47 did that a lot. Thunderbolts came home with multiple engine cylinders gone, stabilizers and chunks of the fuselage missing, or even whole halves of its wing having disappeared. For one, there was the Brazilian pilot Raimundo da Costa Canario, who came home with 2/3 of a right wing after lighting up an armor column and pulled away from the dive, only to realize that he couldn't dodge the factory smokestack right in front of his face in time. Then there was American pilot Mitt Sanders, who was chasing down a German diesel locomotive and ended up bull charging it down the nose, guns blazing. Right as he disables it, his plane gets slapped hard by something, and so he zooms back to altitude and looks around before seeing his left wing missing about 5 to 10 feet off the tip. He makes it home and finds out from his gun camera footage after landing that while he was charging this train, his left wing got into a knife fight with a telephone pole. Then there was the story of First Lieutenant Leslie Bowes, who came home from 4 different Thunderbolt crash landings, all of which were named Blonde Trouble. One of these flew home after taking a direct hit from an 88mm flak round directly to the left wing root, which shredded the everything on that side of the plane. But the Thunderbolt don't care, and it came home anyways. However, when you bring up the P-47's durability, there is one story that inevitably comes to mind. And that story is when Robert S. Johnson, the second highest scoring ace of the European theater with 27 kills, the same guy who outclimbed a Mark 9 Spitfire with a paddle prop, came home from his first taste of combat with the 56th on June 26, 1943. During that mission, his flight was ambushed from above and behind by a pack of FW-190s in which his plane got lit up. His Thunderbolt got lit on fire and thrown into a flat spin, and after a moment of resignation, he told the god of death not today and kicked the rudder against the spin, which actually leveled the aircraft. After trying to bail out of said plane and being unable to, he would look around for a bit and realize he was found by German ace Egon Meyer with 66 kills at the time, who would then try to do his damnedest to shoot Johnson down in 3 separate bursts, but instead ran out of bullets.
Access denied.
After the German pilots saluted him and left in sheer astonishment, Johnson would go home across the English Channel and actually manage to land. But while the gear was fine, the brakes were shot and he had to kick the plane into a bunch of tailspins to slow down, and hilariously enough, ended up parked right next to a line of Spitfires like he was supposed to be there in the first place.
Another happy landing.
Johnson got out, started counting the bullet holes on the airplane, and he would give up after counting more than 200 impacts of just 7.92 without moving around the airplane, and even more of 20mm cannons. But here's the thing that I've always wondered: how much ammo was actually shot at him? Most records appear to indicate that Meyer flew A4, A5, and A6 model FW-190s during his career, but it's specifically noted that Johnson was hit by 30 caliber fire. The only one of those 3 variants to run the 7.92s was the 190A4. Let's go ahead and read off the armament list of the 190A4, shall we? 2 20mm MG-FFM cannons with 90 rounds each in the outboard wing placements, 2 more 20mm MG-151 cannons with 250 rounds each mounted in the wing roots, and 2 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns with 900 rounds each mounted in the top of the nose. Johnson had fewer than 100 20mm cannon holes that he counted on his side of his plane. And then I'm going to err on the side of the German here, because as much as I love the P-47, there is no way it had anywhere near enough plot armor to survive all of that ammunition. So I'm willing to bet that Meyer had already run through his outboard 20mm in the earlier attack and was down to just his inboard cannons and machine guns. Assuming that War Thunder's flight model of the FW-190A4 and its cannon fire rates are an acceptable reference, that means at maximum, the amount of ammo left in Meyer's plane when he started shooting was somewhere around 250 rounds of 20mm and 1,300 rounds of 7.92, which is still a lot, and all of which failed to kill this one P-47 at point blank range. Okay, I take it back, that P-47 did have plot armor. But not even plot armor would save the Thunderbolt for the reputation it should have gotten, but didn't get. The Thunderbolt was so good at everything it got to do that it was never really reported on in the media or the big headlines of the day. And even now, Thunderbolt pilots call their massive contributions to the war in Europe the war that nobody told you about. A few years later, when the Air Force was created in 1947, the P-47 would be renamed the F-47. And honestly, that just feels really weird to say out loud, and it is not a name I am ever going to use willingly. Let me put it to you this way: if I ever call the P-47 the F-47 first, I am being held hostage and I am actively looking for rescue. But post-1947, the P-47 was used as a test bed for a couple of big things. In 1948, the P-47 was used to try out some of America's first attempts to create both subsonic and supersonic air-to-ground missiles via the MX-773 program. Try putting that in War Thunder. The following year in 1949, P-47s would start being used to research a lot of transonics with both swept wings and curved props, because all of the experience it had with getting close to the sound barrier in those dives was actually helpful.
And trust me, it has its perks.
However, the P-47 was eventually phased out of active duties in 1949 as well, so it would not see action in the Korean War. By 1953, the P-47 was fully retired from the Air Force and from the Air National Guard the following year. Multiple NATO allies like Italy, Portugal, and Turkey, other friends like Taiwan, and several Latin American countries would keep flying the P-47s for a little longer, with the last models not being retired from military service until 1966 by Peru. But if I had to sum up the impact of the P-47 on World War II, then probably the best way I could do it is what happened right after the German Operation Bodenplatte, when the Luftwaffe made their last-ditch attack on American air bases in Belgium. After the German attack on Y-34, which pretty much succeeded from a kill-to-loss perspective, the US had captured a German pilot from one of the 16 planes they had shot down. Sitting in the headquarters building, he was cocky at his victory and jabbed his thumb out the window at the fields of fire caused by the 22 destroyed and 8 damaged P-47s from the 356th Fighter Group, the Hellhawks. And in perfect English, he would ask Major George R. Brooking, "What do you think of that?" And considering the damage they had just dealt, the Major didn't really have an answer. Yet. Within just a few days, though, the airfield at Y-34 had been fully repaired and brand new Thunderbolts were lining the taxiway. Major Brooking would then walk into where they were holding the German pilot, jabbed his thumb at the shiny new Thunderbolts and said, "What do you think of that?" And the German sat there, stared at the new Thunderbolts, then looked back at the Major and said, "That is what's beating us." Because that is what the P-47 really was. It was less of a plane and more of a purebred, mass-produced instrument of pure destruction, making up the unsung chorus of American Golden Era air power. It didn't matter what it was up against, this thing was just death.
Straight up.
And I think that's one of the reasons a lot of people always put it second to the Mustang. The P-51 is generally best remembered as the dogfighter that took over for the P-47 because it had better range. And so the P-47 gets this reputation of being in the candlelit shadow of the Mustang's dogfighting and escort prowess. But that's only the glorified half of the story. The war that nobody told you about is this aircraft being an unstoppable juggernaut to the enemy ground forces across the board. When the boots on the ground looked up and saw this giant physics-breaking bird screaming in, they knew they'd be okay, because the P-47 was designed to bring people home, and that didn't just mean the pilots. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.